Hello, and welcome to UT3 Session 5. And in this session, I will be covering triggers and matinees within Unreal's Kismet. Now, as you can see here, I have a subtractive world again, and dividing these two separate rooms is this doorway here. I'm going to select an object from my generic browser for a door or a wall. This seems fine. I'm going to add, not as a static mesh, but as an interpret actor. And the reason why is a static mesh remains static. In other words, it stays in one place. So I need to be able to animate this 3D model. So in order to do that, I need to set it up as an interpret actor. When I add interpret actors into my level, if I'm using the default light, a static light, you're going to notice that my interpret actor is unusually black, as if it's out of place. The light source is not recognizing this. That's because an interpret actor is a dynamic character, only dynamic lighting will detect it. So that has to do with the actual lighting in my level. So I'll have to select the lights by pressing F4 and going to light components under light, and then going to light channels. Over here I have an assortment of channels, and the channel in question is the dynamic channel. When I click that, immediately you can see that our interpret actor is now being properly lit. I'm going to do that for the rest of the lights in my level, because there's no point in having static lights if I'm going to have actors that move. There we go. So now that my level is properly lit, I'm going to increase the size of this interpret actor, move it a little bit here, and I'm also going to check if this interpret actor has collision. I can do that by pressing the properties key again, F4, going to collision, and as I can see here, there is no collision on my 3D object. So I'm going to have to click here and select block all, and now this collision type will block anything and everything that comes in its way, whether it be a player, bullets, or whatever. For those who want to put fences instead of actual walls or doors, you have block all but weapons as an available option for your collision detection as well. But for now, block all is sufficient. So now I have my interpret actor. It's blocking my path. I can't go beyond that door. I'm going to build the level here real quick, and now that everything is properly set up, I'll go right into the triggers. Alright, so as I explained, there are three kinds of triggers that I will be covering in this tutorial. So let me add 3 triggers here. Triggers can be added by right-clicking, going to add actor, and then going to add trigger. And again, I can duplicate things by holding the Alt key. There we go. And now I have 3 triggers. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to go into the properties for each trigger, and I'm going to enable these triggers to be visible when I play my game, because by default triggers are hidden away. You can see the collision detections on each of these triggers. It's this little pink fence thing that's around every trigger here. If you press the C button, you can see collisions and disable them as well. So that's a good way to see your collision detection. You could also scale these in proportion, especially if you use ununiform stretching here. You can see I can stretch and pull my detection radius however I want to. So now that my three triggers are visible, regardless if I'm in the editor or not, I'm going to now open my Kismet window. Kismet is located on the top of here, this big green K, and this will open my Kismet window, which is quite large. So in this Kismet window, I can't do much of anything because I don't have much selected. I have this trigger selected, but I'm going to select this one first. And I'm going to right click anywhere in this gray space. When I right click, I'm given a lot of options that break into options, that break into even more options. So for this trigger, I'm just going to go to this bottom part of the properties window, and I have a choice of choosing which. Like I said, I'm only going to be touching on touch, used, and take damage in this tutorial. So I'm going to make this trigger a touched. I'm going to click this trigger, and I'm going to make this trigger a used, and I'm going to touch this trigger here and make this a take damage. For using the for controls in Unreal Kismet, if you hold the control key on your keyboard and select the Kismet in question, you can multiply your selections, and you could also move your Kismets by pressing and holding down the control key. So I can move one around like this. Also, much like the marquee select tool, when I'm trying to select points, if I hold Control and Alt, I can draw a bounding box on all my Kismets to make multiple selections. So as we see here, we have touch, used, take damage. A good way to test if these triggers work is by holding the L key, which is the log. This prints out a log on your chat window when you open the editor to see if things work. So I'm going to make 3 logs. Again, I hold L and left click on the Unreal Kismet, and I'm going to print this out on the screen to the player. If you hold P and left click, you create a player variable, which is you. Now let's talk a little bit on these properties here. As you can see, each Kismet has slightly different properties because they have slightly different functions, as I listed. But some of them have some things in common. Say, for instance, the max trigger count, the amount of times this trigger will work. The default setting is always 1. So that means if you use this trigger once, that's it, it's done. You can obviously customize it for however many times you want, but for an infinite number of times, you want to hit 0. 0 always makes the trigger work regardless of how many times it's been used. So I'm going to do that. And now I'm going to tell this log that when this trigger is touched, something happens to the log and is directed to the player. So in this log, I'm going to write in the object comment touched, and in this one I'm going to write used, and in this one I'm going to write damaged. If I build the connections here and go into my level, I have touched and just walking up to it and it just touched. Over here I have used. If I go up to it and press the E key, I'm using it like a special item. And take damage, I had to shoot it multiple times, but it worked. So here are some more options for these particular things. For example, if I'm using an item or using a button or using this trigger, I can make it easier to use by saying be aim to interact disabled. This makes it so that when I'm looking at this trigger, I don't necessarily have to put my crosshair on it just to use it. And I could just simply be within its vicinity and press the use button and it will work. As for damage, I can give it a damage threshold. Right now it started at 100 HP, which explains why I had to shoot it so many times. But if I reduce the number to 1 HP, every time I shoot a bullet, that thing will always say damaged on my chat sequence thing here. So now that we know our 3 triggers work, now it's time to put in our Matinee sequences. So I'm going to select all these guys. I'm going to delete this. And now to use our Matinee. First, I'm going to use the touch. If I right click and select New Matinee, this is going to bring out a Matinee sequence in which I can use this trigger to activate. So I'm going to say when I touch this trigger, this Matinee will play. Now in order for me to make the proper animations for this anime, for this Matinee, I have to click the door and then I have to double click the Matinee. This will bring up the Matinee window, which will enable me to make the proper animations. It's always good to make sure that you have this clicked. It's the snapper. When you're moving about your timeline here, you see how it sort of snaps into place. It's just easier to keep track of things that way. It's just much smoother to work with. So I'm going to set this for 3 seconds. And next, I'm going to right click in this dark gray area and select Add New Empty Group. I'm going to call this Door. Next, I'm going to click this and right click on it and then Add New Movement Track. This is telling the editor that I am intending to move this object. So I'm going to scroll on my timeline all the way to the last frame, which is 3 seconds. It's going to take 3 seconds for this door to move up. And I'm going to leave it there. And after I finish moving, I press Enter. I may have to click on the actual movement here. So after you move it, click movement and then press Enter, and you'll get a second keyframe here. The keyframe can be moved if you hold the Control key on your keyboard, and you can drag it up and down as you see it. And it's always good to test to see if your animation is working as you want it to. So slide this black bar across and you can see that our door is in fact working. So now let's go into the game and see what happens when we touch our trigger. Excellent, it opens. So that works. Next, I'm going to use the used key. And once again, I'm going to create another Matinee. Or I could just use the same one. Pretty much, I could just do this. And the same result will occur when I go to my middle used one here, use trigger, press E, and voila, we have the animation work. I could also take this animation and plug it into my take damage. Go into the level again. Shoot, and voila, the door opens. Alright, so let's say we want to add a little more immersion to our level, I could say. I can go into my Kismet. Actually, let me do that. Drag this up. And let's say I want it to, when I touch it, it's going to play this. In my Kismet, if I right click, go to New Action, go to Sound, go to play sound, this will enable me to play a sound when I touch this trigger. I can do this by plugging this trigger into the play sound Kismet. And obviously the player is going to be affected by this sound, so that when I touch this trigger, this sound will play that the player will hear. So now we have to search which sound we want to put in. Well, we can either click here, which is to show the generic browser, or you can click up here, but for the sake of easement, here we go. Now I'm presented with my Kismet, and over here I have all sorts of sound effects, character sound effects, footsteps, miscellaneous things, all sorts of stuff. And I can listen to each sound by double clicking them. Again, remember that when these packages are light gray, you have to fully load the package. So remember to right click your packages and fully load them so that you can see all the things that are inside your packages. One thing that we discovered in class was that mono sounds cannot be plugged in to here for some strange reason, and only ambient sounds work for plugging things in. So for now, just try to look for ambient sounds such as these that are listed as ambient, which will work with your play sound radiuses. So let me see. These are buildings shaking. Just looking at through some sounds here. You probably can't hear the sounds that I'm listening to, so I guess I'll just choose any random sound here. A lot of these are mono. Here we go. So I'm going to select this, which is an ambient, and I'm going to click the green arrow where it says play sound, so that when I touch this trigger, this sound is played. So here I go, I'm right clicking, going into my level, and the sound is played and the door is risen. And that's how you do interpret actors with triggers and matinees.